"Here, clean something. At least you'll be useful." That was what my daughter-in-law said to me on Mother's Day as she tossed a broom toward my feet. Her words still echo in my mind, like sharp glass cutting into my heart. Mother's Day is supposed to be filled with kindness and gratitude, but for me, it became a reminder of how easily respect can be stripped away. I had woken up that morning hoping for a simple greeting, maybe even a hug from my son or a drawing from my granddaughter. Instead, humiliation was handed to me by the very woman who had married into my family. I bent down, picked up the broom, and quietly leaned it against the wall. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. Silence felt heavier than anger. My son looked conflicted, but he said nothing, while my granddaughter shifted nervously in her seat. I stood there, trying to hold my pride together like fragile glass. If you've ever felt disrespected by someone in your own family, you'll understand the ache I carried that day. And if you want to hear how I turned that pain into strength, stay with me until the end. This story will surprise you. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. I remember thinking, maybe she expected me to scream, to throw the broom back at her, to create a scene she could use against me later. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. Instead, I let my silence weigh on everyone in the room. Mother's Day ended not with flowers or warmth, but with me holding back tears behind closed doors. Still, deep down, I knew life had its way of balancing things. And 1 week later, it did. After that humiliating Mother's Day, I spent the evening replaying the moment in my head. The broom against my feet, her smirk, the silence from my son, all of it sat heavy in my chest. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, her voice echoed, "At least you'll be useful, useful," as if decades of raising a family, keeping a roof over our heads, and building a life from scratch with my late husband meant nothing. Let me tell you about the years before all this, so you'll understand why those words stung so deeply. My husband passed away more than a decade ago. He left me this modest, 2-story home we had worked hard to buy. It wasn't fancy, but it held our memories. Every corner carried echoes of laughter, dinners, and celebrations. After his death, I poured my energy into making sure my son could finish school without worry. I sacrificed vacations, new clothes, and every luxury so he could build a future. When he married, I welcomed his new wife into my heart. I tried to make her feel comfortable in our family, cooking her favorite meals, giving her small gifts, even offering to babysit their daughter whenever they needed rest. I thought kindness would build a bridge. Instead, it became a weapon used against me. From the beginning, there were small remarks, little jabs at how I dressed, or how old-fashioned my cooking tasted. She often rolled her eyes when I offered advice about raising children, as though my years of experience meant nothing. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she felt nervous about fitting in. But the truth was darker. It wasn't insecurity. It was disdain. As months turned into years, the comments became sharper. She criticized me in front of neighbors, dismissing me as the old woman with nothing to do. During family dinners, she made sure to seat me at the far end of the table, away from the center of conversation. And when I dared to laugh or share a story, she interrupted, saying I talked too much. What hurt most was my son's silence. I could see him struggling, caught between loyalty to me and his marriage. Sometimes, he gave me a small apologetic glance, but he never said a word. That silence was like salt on an open wound. Do you know what silence feels like? It's not just quiet, it's a deep loneliness, especially when it comes from those who should defend you. If you've ever been in that position, you'll understand the ache. And if this story resonates with you, I'd love for you to leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, because your voice matters here in ways mine was ignored at home. I tried to remain patient. I told myself, she's young, she'll grow out of it. Marriage will teach her respect. Parenthood will soften her heart. But instead, every year, she grew bolder. When I offered to help with laundry, she scoffed, "We don't want it smelling like mothballs." When I folded napkins at dinner, she sneered, "You can't even fold them straight." And yet, I kept quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I knew arguing would only fuel her fire. I had learned in life that revenge isn't always about striking back immediately. It's about letting time reveal the truth. Still, nothing prepared me for Mother's Day. That broom wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a declaration that in her eyes, I was nothing. And that day, My son's silence hurt almost as much as her insult. I sat alone later that night, staring at the framed picture of my late husband, whispering, "Did we raise him wrong? Did we give too much and teach too little?" I wondered if maybe my place in their home was truly as useless as she said. Should I pack up, leave, and live out my remaining years in quiet solitude? But every time I thought of leaving, I remembered the promise I had made to my husband on his deathbed, to keep the family together as best as I could. That promise tethered me, even when the respect I deserved was long gone. Over the next week, her behavior didn't change. If anything, she grew more careless in showing her disdain. She tossed her laundry basket at me one morning with a casual, "Since you're not doing anything, you can fold these." Another day, she loudly complained on the phone to a friend that she had to live with a useless old woman who thinks she's still important. Her words pierced me, though I tried to hide it. But something else was happening in the background, something she didn't notice. My son was watching. He saw the way she spoke to me, the way she treated me as less than human. He watched my silence, my calmness, my refusal to stoop to her level. And though he said nothing at first, I noticed his eyes growing darker each time she crossed the line. Sometimes, when I passed him in the hallway, I could feel his gaze linger on me with a heaviness that suggested guilt, maybe even shame. He didn't speak, but I could tell the silence between us was shifting. It's in moments like these that I remind myself, and I want you to remember this too, that patience is often the strongest form of revenge. Life has a way of balancing things, even when we least expect it. If you've ever been underestimated, stay patient. Your moment will come. That moment for me arrived sooner than I thought. Exactly 1 week after Mother's Day, the silence finally broke not from my lips but from my son's. And what he said next would change everything. The days after Mother's Day blurred together in a haze of tension. Every time I stepped into the kitchen or living room, my daughter-in-law seemed to find a reason to belittle me. Her voice carried sharp edges, cutting into me with remarks that might have sounded small to an outsider but were daggers to someone living under the same roof. One morning, I was making tea when she walked in, sighing loudly as though my presence alone inconvenienced her. "You always leave the kettle in the wrong place," she muttered, grabbing it from the counter and slamming it down near the stove. I bit my tongue, swallowing the urge to respond. Later that afternoon, I folded laundry at the table while she scrolled through her phone on the couch. Without looking up, she tossed a shirt onto the floor near me and said, "That one's wrinkled. Do it again." Honestly, what's the point of you staying here if you can't do things right? Her words were like steady drops of water, wearing away at stone. Each one eroded a little more of the patience I tried to hold on to. Yet, I refused to explode. I knew losing my temper would only confirm her accusations. But while she thought her cruelty went unnoticed, my son was watching. I caught glimpses of his expression, his brow furrowed, lips pressed into a hard line, jaw tightening when she spoke to me that way. He didn't intervene, not yet, but I could see the storm brewing behind his silence. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, she served herself first, piling her plate high while leaving little for the rest of us. When I reached for the vegetables, she sneered, "Don't take too much. We need to save for people who actually work around here." My fork froze halfway to my plate. My son's head snapped up. For a moment, I thought he might finally speak. His eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on his knife, but then he exhaled and looked down at his food. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the clinking of silverware. My granddaughter, sensing the tension, stared at her plate without touching it. That night, I overheard them arguing in their bedroom. My daughter-in-law's voice was shrill. "Your mother doesn't do anything. She just takes up space and makes me miserable." My son's voice was lower, but I caught the edge of anger in his tone. "She's my mother. Show her some respect." The walls muffled the rest, but those words gave me a small flicker of hope. Maybe he was starting to see the truth. Still, her cruelty didn't stop. In fact, she seemed emboldened, as though she believed my son would never choose me over her. She mocked my cooking, saying, "This tastes like hospital food," in front of my granddaughter. She rolled her eyes whenever I offered to help with homework. She even told a neighbor within earshot, "I basically have 2 children to care for my daughter and his mother." I stayed quiet, letting her words hang in the air like poison. But my son's face grew darker each day. His patience, once endless, now frayed at the edges. One afternoon, the breaking point nearly came. I had spent hours cleaning the living room, dusting shelves, vacuuming rugs, polishing picture frames. When she returned from shopping, she barely glanced around before tossing her bags onto the couch. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing at a tiny speck of dust on the windowsill. "What exactly did you do all day?" Before I could reply, my son entered the room. His gaze followed her finger to the speck, then shifted to the vacuum still humming quietly in the corner. He didn't say anything, but his silence was different this time. It wasn't avoidance, it was disapproval directed at her. She didn't notice. She never noticed. That night, as I sat in my room folding towels, my son knocked softly and stepped inside. For a moment, he didn't speak, just looked at me with weary eyes. Finally, he said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have defended you sooner." The words nearly broke me. I wanted to hug him, tell him it was enough just to hear him say it, but I held back. Instead, I smiled faintly and said, "You don't need to apologize. You see what you need to see in your own time." He nodded, his jaw tightening again, and I knew then that something inside him had shifted. The man who had sat silent at Mother's Day was gone. The son I had raised, the one who valued loyalty and respect, was resurfacing. Still, I stayed quiet. I didn't want to be the one to push him into conflict with his wife. I wanted him to make his own choice, without me as the catalyst. Days passed, and the tension grew unbearable. My daughter-in-law's insults continued, her smirk ever present, her disdain unshaken. But each cruel word she spoke was no longer just an attack on me, it was a chisel breaking away at the foundation of her marriage. And though she couldn't see it, her downfall was already beginning. The breaking point came, not in whispers behind closed doors, but out in the open, in front of family and neighbors who had gathered for a small weekend cookout. I had spent most of the morning preparing side dishes, cutting vegetables, and setting the table in the backyard. It was a sunny afternoon, and I wanted everything to look welcoming. When my daughter-in-law came outside, she barely glanced at my work. Instead, she picked up a plate of salad I had made and held it up like it was a joke. "Does anyone actually eat this stuff anymore?" she said loudly, drawing a few awkward chuckles. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth. My son shot her a look, but she ignored it. Then, in front of everyone, she leaned toward me and sneered. "Honestly, you should just sit down and stop pretending you're helping. You're too old for this. Maybe you should go knit something instead." The laughter died instantly. Even the neighbors who had chuckled earlier shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between us. My face burned with humiliation, but I stayed silent. I straightened the cutlery, pretending not to hear, though every word sank into me like a stone. My granddaughter looked up at her mother, then at me, confusion written all over her young face. She didn't understand why her grandmother was being mocked. That look in her eyes hurt worse than the insult itself. For a brief second, I thought my son would stay silent again. But then he slammed his glass down on the table so hard the ice rattled. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp, carrying across the yard. Everyone fell silent. My daughter-in-law blinked, surprised. "What? I was just joking." "That wasn't a joke," my son said coldly. "That was cruel. She's my mother. Show her some respect." The tension thickened. My daughter-in-law's face flushed red, but instead of backing down, she scoffed. "Respect? For what? She doesn't do anything. She just sits around, getting in the way. I'm the one managing this house, not her." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my composure. I refused to let her see me break. My son's chair screeched against the patio as he stood up. "You've gone too far," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "She built this home with my father. Everything we have started because of her sacrifices. Don't you dare call her useless." The look on my daughter-in-law's face was a mix of shock and indignation. She opened her mouth to fire back, but no words came out. For the first time, she realized her husband wasn't going to side with her. The rest of the cookout was tense and quiet. Neighbors left early, murmuring awkward goodbyes. My granddaughter clung to me, as if she sensed the storm that was about to break apart her home. That evening, after everyone had gone, the shouting began. I sat upstairs in my room, folding laundry with trembling hands, while below me, voices clashed like thunder. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," my daughter-in-law shrieked. "No, my son's voice roared back. You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed me by disrespecting my mother in front of neighbors, in front of our child. I won't tolerate it anymore. The walls shook with her fury. So what? You're going to choose her over me? That's what this is about, isn't it? You're still a mama's boy. Her words stabbed me, though I wasn't in the room. I pressed a towel to my chest, steadying my breathing. I didn't want to be the cause of their destruction, yet I knew she had brought this upon herself. Downstairs, his voice dropped lower, more controlled, but I could hear the edge of steel in it. If respecting my mother makes me a mama's boy, then fine. I'd rather be that than the kind of person who humiliates family in front of others. The argument went on late into the night, slamming doors, muffled sobs, heavy footsteps back and forth. My granddaughter eventually crept into my room, curling up beside me. I stroked her hair until she fell asleep, the sound of her parents' fight echoing through the house. In the quiet that followed, I thought about how far things had gone. I had endured years of disrespect, hoping for change, hoping for peace. But now, change was coming whether I wanted it or not. My silence had drawn a line she didn't see until she crossed it, and now my son was the one fighting battles I never asked him to fight. The next morning, the house was cold with tension. My daughter-in-law avoided me completely, her eyes burning whenever they met mine. My son, however, lingered near me more often, his words softer, his gestures protective. He hadn't said it yet, but I could feel it. He was nearing a decision. The balance of power in their marriage was shifting, and she had no idea how close she was to losing everything she had taken for granted. One more spark, one more cruel remark, and the fire would consume it all. And deep down, I knew her downfall was no longer in my hands. It was in his. The morning after the cookout, the house was suffocating with tension. My daughter-in-law moved around the kitchen with harsh movements, banging drawers and slamming cabinets. The clatter of pots and pans was less about cooking and more about sending a message. Anger pulsed through every sound. My son sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. His eyes followed her, not with affection, but with a quiet fury simmering just beneath the surface. I sat in my chair by the window, knitting needles in hand, though I barely made any progress. The rhythm of the needles usually calmed me, but that day they clicked unevenly as my hands trembled. My granddaughter played quietly on the floor, sensing the storm swirling around her. Finally, the silence shattered. You humiliated me yesterday, my daughter-in-law snapped, whirling around to face my son. Her eyes were blazing, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My son set his mug down slowly, deliberately. No, he said, his tone controlled but firm. You humiliated yourself. You humiliated me. You humiliated my mother. Her mouth fell open. Your mother? She's the reason everyone was looking at me like that. She acts like a victim, and you just feed into it. I lowered my gaze to my knitting, pretending to count stitches, though every word pierced me. I had promised myself not to interfere, but hearing her twist the truth made my chest ache. My son stood, pushing his chair back with a screech. She didn't say a word, not one word. She stayed quiet while you tore her down in front of our neighbors. Do you not see how wrong that is? She's old. My daughter-in-law shot back. She should be grateful she even has a roof over her head. I'm the one making this house run, not her. What does she do all day? Fold towels? Dust shelves? That's not work. That's nothing. I froze, my needles stilling in my lap. My son's face turned crimson, his hands clenched into fists. Nothing? He echoed, his voice low and dangerous. You call the woman who raised me, who built this home with my father, who sacrificed everything so I could have a future nothing. The room went silent. My granddaughter looked up from her toys, eyes wide. You think you run this house? He continued, his voice rising. This is my mother's house. The only reason you have a roof over your head is because of her. Every wall, every piece of furniture, every inch of this place carries her sweat and sacrifice. And you dare call her useless? For the first time, my daughter-in-law looked unsettled. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to him. So what? You're taking her side now. You're choosing her over me? My son's voice was steady. I'm choosing respect. And if you can't give that to my mother, then yes, I'll choose her every time. Her face twisted with rage. Unbelievable. After everything I've done for you, you're going to throw it away for her? Everything you've done for me? He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. You've disrespected my mother for years. You've turned this house into a battlefield. That's not love. That's not partnership. That's poison." She gasped as though he had struck her. "So this is it? You're threatening to leave me? Over her?" "I'm not threatening," he said flatly. "I'm telling you, if this doesn't change, if you can't show my mother even the basic decency she deserves, then I won't stay. I won't raise our daughter in a house where cruelty is the norm." My hands trembled so badly the knitting slipped from my lap. My granddaughter crawled into my arms, sensing my unease. I held her close, my heart pounding. "You wouldn't dare," my daughter-in-law whispered, her voice shaking now. "Watch me," he said, his jaw tight. The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. I wanted to say something, to ease the tension, but I knew this wasn't my battle. This was between them, and interfering would only weaken his stance. So I stayed quiet, rocking my granddaughter gently, my eyes fixed on the window. Over the next few days, the house became a war zone. My daughter-in-law alternated between fury and desperation. One moment she screamed at him, hurling accusations of betrayal. The next, she begged him to forgive her, promising she'd change. But her behavior toward me didn't soften. If anything, her resentment grew sharper. She slammed doors when I passed, muttered insults under her breath, and once even knocked a basket of laundry from my hands, smirking as the clothes spilled across the floor. I bent down slowly, picking each piece up, refusing to give her the reaction she craved. But when I glanced up, I saw my son standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. He didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes told me his patience was gone. One evening, the shouting reached a peak. I sat in my room with the door closed, my granddaughter asleep beside me, when my daughter-in-law's voice rose loud enough to rattle the walls. "She doesn't belong here. It's either her or me." My heart stopped. The choice she demanded was one I had dreaded hearing, but in my soul, I already knew the answer my son would give. His voice came back, firm and unyielding. "Then you've made this easy. It's her, always her." I covered my mouth, tears spilling down my cheeks. For years I had endured her cruelty in silence, never asking my son to choose. And now, he had chosen not because I begged him to, but because he finally saw the truth for himself. Downstairs, she wailed, screaming accusations, calling him weak, calling me manipulative. But her words had lost their power. His voice cut through, steady as steel. "Pack your things. I won't let you treat my mother this way another day." The sound of suitcases being dragged across the floor echoed through the house. I held my granddaughter tighter, my tears falling onto her hair. When the noise subsided, my son climbed the stairs and stood in my doorway. His eyes were tired, his shoulders heavy, but there was a clarity in his gaze I hadn't seen in years. "It's over," he said simply. I nodded, unable to find my voice. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him he didn't have to sacrifice his marriage for me. But I knew deep down this wasn't my doing. This was her doing. She had sown the seeds of her own downfall, and now she was reaping the harvest. That night, for the first time in years, the house was quiet. No insults, no slamming doors, no poisoned laughter, just silence, the kind of silence that feels like peace instead of punishment. As I lay in bed, I whispered a prayer of gratitude, not for her leaving, but for my son's courage. And in that moment, I knew the story was far from over. The fallout had only just begun. The days that followed were heavy with change. For the first time in years, the house didn't echo with her sharp words. Instead, it rang with the quiet shuffle of boxes being packed. My daughter-in-law moved through the rooms with frantic energy, throwing clothes into suitcases, slamming drawers, and muttering curses under her breath. Every sound was laced with fury, but underneath it all, I could hear fear. My son stayed calm, though his face was lined with exhaustion. He followed her through the house not to help, but to make sure their daughter wasn't caught in the crossfire. He spoke only when necessary, his voice clipped and final. There was no softness left in his tone, no hesitation. One evening, as she sat on the edge of their bed surrounded by half-packed bags, she broke down. Her hands covered her face, shoulders shaking with sobs. "Please," she cried, "don't do this. We can fix it. I'll be better. I'll respect her. I'll try." Her words floated upstairs to where I stood in the hallway. Unseen, my chest tightened, and for a moment, I wondered if he would bend. Marriage is a complicated bond, and I knew he loved her once. But his reply was steady, resolute. You had years to try. Years. I begged you quietly. I looked the other way. I gave you every chance. But you chose cruelty over kindness every time. I can't live like that anymore. I won't let my daughter grow up thinking it's normal to treat her grandmother or anyone with that kind of disrespect. I crisis. His words sank into the silence like stones dropped into deep water. She cried harder, clutching at his arm, but he gently pulled away. It's too late, he said softly. You crossed a line you can't uncross. The next morning, I found him in the living room with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. My granddaughter stood beside him, her small backpack clutched tightly. He looked at me with weary eyes, but there was determination in them too. Mom, he said quietly, we're coming home, if that's okay with you. I nearly dropped the dish towel I was holding. My throat tightened, and tears blurred my vision. Of course it's okay, I whispered. This has always been your home. He nodded, a faint smile flickering across his lips. I should have said something sooner. I should have defended you sooner. I can't undo the years I let her treat you that way, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again. Before I could answer, my daughter-in-law stormed into the room. Her face was red, her eyes swollen from crying. You're really leaving? She shouted. You're going to run back to your mommy like a little boy? My son didn't flinch. No, he said evenly. I'm going to protect my mother, my daughter, and myself. If you can't be part of that, then you'll have to live without us. She let out a bitter laugh, but it was hollow. You'll regret this. You'll come crawling back. Maybe, he said, shouldering his bag. But I doubt it. All. I stood frozen, torn between heartbreak and relief. Heartbreak because a marriage was crumbling before my eyes, but relief because the truth had finally come to light. My silence, once mistaken for weakness, had spoken louder than any words. As they walked toward the door, my granddaughter ran back and threw her arms around me. Grandma, she whispered, are we really going to live with you? I knelt down, hugging her tightly. Yes, sweetheart, I said, my voice shaking. We'll be together. I, too. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt warmth bloom in my chest. My daughter-in-law stood at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her hands gripping the railing. She looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, as though the power she once wielded had evaporated overnight. You'll regret this, she said again, but her voice was weak now, almost desperate. My son glanced back once, then shook his head. No, he replied firmly. The only thing I regret is letting it go on this long. IW. And with that, we walked out together, my son, my granddaughter, and me. The door closed behind us with a quiet finality that felt like freedom. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. Instead, I breathed deeply, letting the cool morning air wash over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of humiliation alone. My son had lifted it from my shoulders, not because I asked, but because he finally saw the truth for himself. And though part of me mourned for the family we once tried to build, a stronger part whispered, this is the beginning of something better. When we returned to my house, the air felt lighter. My son carried his duffel bag upstairs, placing it in his old bedroom, as though years hadn't passed since he last lived there. My granddaughter ran from room to room, her laughter echoing in the hallways, delighted by the familiar comfort of a place she had always associated with safety. For May, it felt like life had come full circle. But behind us, the silence of my daughter-in-law's absence loomed large. I knew she wouldn't let go so easily, and I was right. Within days, the calls began. At first, they came late at night. The phone rang endlessly, her number flashing on the screen. My son ignored them, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with resolve. Eventually, the calls came at all hours, morning, noon, and night. She left messages that swung wildly between anger and desperation. You'll regret this. You'll see you can't survive without me. Please come back. I'll change. I promise I'll change. You're ruining our family. She's manipulating you. Each voicemail was more frantic than the last. My son deleted them without listening to the end. One afternoon, she showed up at the house. I was in the garden, trimming roses, when I saw her car pull up. She stepped out, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen. For the first time, she didn't look powerful or smug, she looked broken. She marched to the front door, banging her fist against it. Open up, we need to talk. My son appeared beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder. "Stay here, Mom," he said gently before walking to the door. Through the open window, I heard their voices. "Please," she begged. "Just come home. We can fix this. I'll treat her better, I swear." It's too late," he said firmly. "You had years to treat her better. You had every chance, and you chose to tear her down instead. I won't let my daughter grow up in that kind of environment." Her voice cracked. "You're really choosing her over me?" "I'm choosing respect," he replied. "And if that means leaving you behind, then yes." The sound of her sobs carried out into the yard. For a moment, I almost pitied her. Almost. But then I remembered every cruel word, every smirk, every time she tried to strip me of dignity. She had planted these seeds herself. Now she was living with the harvest. She left that day, slamming her car door, tires screeching as she sped away. But even then, she didn't give up. In the weeks that followed, she tried everything, sending flowers, writing letters, even asking mutual friends to intervene. Each attempt was more desperate than the last. But my son's resolve didn't waver. "I gave her enough chances," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch. "I won't make the same mistake again." At night, I sometimes lay awake, listening to the quiet of the house. It was a different kind of silence, now peaceful instead of painful. My granddaughter slept soundly in the next room, her soft breathing, a reminder that innocence deserved protection. My son, though weary, carried himself with newfound strength. And me? I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Dignity, not because I had shouted or fought back, but because life itself had restored balance. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, but in the end, it was the loudest statement of all. One afternoon, as I prepared dinner, my son came into the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, watching me stir the pot. "You know," he said quietly, "you never once asked me to take your side. You never tried to make me choose. That means more than you know." I looked at him, my eyes stinging with tears. "I didn't need to ask. The truth speaks for itself." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "And now she knows it too." I served dinner that night with a lighter heart. For the first time in so long, the table felt whole again. My granddaughter chattered happily, my son joined in with laughter, and I simply listened, soaking in the warmth. My daughter-in-law's absence was a wound, yes, but it was one she had inflicted on herself. And though I didn't celebrate her pain, I couldn't deny the justice in it. As I cleared the dishes, I whispered a quiet prayer, not for her return, but for her to finally learn the lesson she had ignored for so long. Respect isn't a gift you demand, it's something you earn, and once lost, it's nearly impossible to reclaim. And for me, the lesson was clear as well. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is not action, but patience. When I look back on everything that happened, I don't think about the broom or the cruel words as much as I think about what followed. The broom was just an object. What truly cut me was the way she looked at me as if my existence had no value. That moment could have broken me, but instead, it revealed the strength I didn't even know I still carried. In the end, I never raised my voice. I never plotted revenge, never shouted back. I simply waited, and waiting, as it turns out, was the loudest statement I could make. My silence let her words echo, not just in my heart, but in the ears of the one person who mattered most, my son. When he chose to walk away from her and back into my home, it wasn't because I begged him. It wasn't because I demanded loyalty. It was because he finally saw the truth for himself. He saw that cruelty, no matter how cleverly disguised as jokes or frustration, poisons everything it touches. He saw that respect isn't optional, it's the foundation of family. Now, life is calmer. My granddaughter fills the house with laughter. My son helps with dinner, sharing stories from work, his voice no longer strained with tension. And I, for the first time in years, sleep without the weight of humiliation pressing down on me. The silence in our home is no longer painful, it's peaceful. Do I pity her? Sometimes. She lost her husband, her child's stability, and the family she could have cherished. But pity doesn't erase the truth. She made her choices, and choices have consequences. Respect was never hers to demand, it was hers to give, and she refused. I've learned something through all of this. Revenge doesn't always come from grand gestures or fiery confrontations. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply living with dignity while time reveals the truth. If you've ever been underestimated, disrespected, or silenced, I hope my story shows you that patience is not weakness. Standing tall without shouting back takes courage. And sooner or later, life has a way of bringing justice in its own time. I wonder, have you ever been in my shoes? Have you been disrespected by someone you welcomed into your family? How did you handle it? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because sharing our stories gives us strength and reminds us we're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Silent Sweet Revenge. There are so many more family revenge stories I want to share with you, stories that prove dignity, patience, and quiet strength can sometimes be the most powerful form of justice. As I close this chapter, I sit on the porch in the evenings with my son and granddaughter beside me. We watch the sun dip below the horizon, and I feel the kind of peace money can't buy. The broom is long forgotten, but the lesson it brought remains forever, because in the end, she thought she had the power. But the truth? The power was always mine.